there. Welcome to Chapter 1 of your lecture notes. This is Teaching Students with Moderate to Severe Intellectual Disabilities in General Ed Classrooms, Foundational Beliefs. In addition to these lecture notes, there will also be some supplemental materials on the page where the questions are for Chapter 1 and Chapter 2. And so be sure you watch the supplemental materials or view the supplemental materials because they may be helpful in you doing the assignments that are connected to the textbook. So the key concepts for Chapter 1, and these are the ones that you're going to discuss in your discussion questions. Students with moderate to severe intellectual disabilities can learn and acquire many skills. Progress has been made toward the inclusion of students with severe disabilities in general education, but considerable work remains. Inclusive education ensures access to the core curriculum and active participation in the general education lesson with necessary supports and services. Skilled teachers with high expectations are needed to help maximize learning potential. And recommended educational practices include the presumption of competence, inclusive education, strong family involvement, positive behavior support, and self-determination training. Be sure you read the textbook because what I'm giving you is meant to illuminate the textbook. It doesn't substitute for the textbook. So be sure that you get a copy and read it. So the first thing you need to know is the connection between this video and the discussion assignment. You really have two different assignments for your chapters. One assignment is to answer questions about this chapter, and this is on the lecture assignment page. The other assignment is a discussion assignment, and that's where you're going to look at those key concepts on the previous page. So where we start is with this concept. Students with moderate to severe intellectual disabilities can learn and acquire many skills. So where we start with this is just a little brief overview of the history of special education. You may or may not know this, but special education has a birthday. Special education started in 1799. And what happened in 1799 was that there was a doctor in France named Itard, and a young boy was brought into his practice, and this young boy had been living out in the woods. His name was Victor, or they called him Victor. Victor had no language. He had no self-care skills. He basically lived, the word they used was a noble savage. He lived out in the woods outside of Aveyron, France. And so he was called Victor, the wild boy of Aveyron. You can look it up online and read about more about Victor. But what happened was that Itard set about trying to civilize Victor. He wanted to, the word he used was excite his nervous sensibilities. In other words, nervous system, not as in I'm nervous about something. But what he wanted to do was to use visual, auditory, kinesthetic enhancement to try to get him to connect to the world around him. He worked with Victor for about 3 years. He used individualized instruction. He used multimodal instruction. He did self-care skills. And at the end of those 3 years, Victor could say 3 words. He could say milk, water, and oh my God. And he could feed himself and he could dress himself, and that was about it. And Itard considered himself to be a failure. But we call him the father of special education because he was the first one to recognize that no matter how significant a disability somebody has, they can learn something. And he was successful at that. And so after him came a series of practitioners who decided that the best way to teach people with severe disabilities was to put them in separate facilities where we could concentrate on teaching them. And so there was a movement to build institutions and put people in the institutions. And in the early 1800s, it worked very well, that they would put people in the institutions, they would train them, and then they'd put them back into the community. But then we had the Industrial Revolution in the United States. We had the Civil War. We had moving from rural to urban society. And so the place for people who needed a lot of support wasn't there anymore. And so then they began to build institutions just to keep people, they called it warm, dry, and happy. Just put them away somewhere where they would be comfortable. As time went by, we began to see a movement called the eugenics movement that said that the best way to improve mankind was through selective breeding and getting rid of people that were not particularly successful. And so they began to sterilize people with disabilities and put them in institutions to keep them away from everybody. And the ultimate version of this was in Nazi Germany, where they actually, before they started exterminating the Jews, they started exterminating people with disabilities, and gypsies were exterminated before the Jews were exterminated. And so then after World War II, we began to have a point where people in institutions were just forgotten people, that they just lived there and no one really knew what was going on. And so in the 1970s, there was a professor at Syracuse University called Burton Blatt. And Burton Blatt went in with video cameras into residential facilities in New York State. And he first started with still photography. And he took some of the most horrific pictures you've ever seen in your life. And those pictures illustrated how people in institutions were being not just neglected, but they were being cruelly treated. And so we began what was called the deinstitutionalization movement. And the deinstitutionalization movement just was based on normalization, that people with disabilities had a right to live a normal life, to have a normal rhythm of the day, to be able to make choices. And so we moved from huge institutions. For instance, in Alabama, they had an institution with over 5,000 people in the 1970s. By the 1990s, that institution was down to about 500 people. Then we had two court cases that were really important in the 1970s. One was PARC, Pennsylvania Association for Retarded Citizens, and the second one was Mills. And in both of these, the issue was right to education, that if we have compulsory school that says everybody has to go to school, then that means people with disabilities have to go to school. But in the PARC case, what the school district said was that there are some people that can't learn. And so if you can't learn, then we don't have to teach you. And what the court decided in the PARC case was that everybody can learn something. And so this whole idea we have now that all students can learn, that was a legal ruling in 1971 in the PARC case. So then we moved to two curricular approaches. One was called a developmental approach, and this was predominantly in the 70s. And then we moved to a functional approach, which was more in the 80s and 90s. In the developmental approach, we looked at the person's developmental age. You hear people say he's got a mental age of 5. That's what we were looking at. And we looked at language and social and fine motor and gross motor and cognitive and self-care. And we would give them an inventory and we'd say, okay, he's on the 6-month level in fine motor, but he's on the 24-month level in language, or he's on the 3-year-old level in cognitive. And we based our skills, we would teach the skills starting at the level they were on and then chronologically moving up. In the 1990s, there became an understanding that because people with significant disabilities learn slowly and forget easily and they don't generalize well, then what would happen was that they would be in permanent practice. They would never get beyond a very limited age. And so instead of looking at developmental age, we began to look at chronological age. And we began to look at functional domains. And so, in other words, where is this person going to live their life? In the school, in the community, in the domestic reign, in recreation, leisure, in vocational. And then we looked at environments and sub-environments in each of those. So like in the school community area, everybody goes to Walmart. And so when you go to Walmart, what are the parts of Walmart? Well, there's the parking lot, there's the checkout counter, there's the garden shop, there's the deli, there's where the clothing is. And then we would look at the activities. What activities do you do in each one of those places? And then we'd look at the skills. So if I'm in Walmart, if I'm in the clothing section, and I want to try on clothes, then which of these language, social, emotional, fine motor, gross motor, cognitive, self-care skills do I need to try on clothes? And then we would look at adaptations. Well, in recent years, what we begin to understand is that as long as we're teaching people separately, then they're not going to see the world the way other people are. And so we began to look at inclusion. And at first, inclusion looked at social integration, peer buddies, looking at community referenced instruction. So we're not going to just look at how do you go to a store, but how do you go to the store that your family goes to, like Walmart. Specialized curriculum. We had this separate functional curriculum for people with severe disabilities. And we had pull-out programs where we pulled them out for physical therapy and occupational therapy and speech and language. Now, what we do instead is we have general education placement, kids with the most significant disabilities in the regular class all day. We have extended curriculum. Instead of having a specialized curriculum, they have language arts, math, and science. But we extend it so that we can reach the skills that they can do with accommodations. We have what are called circle of friends. Instead of having a peer buddy assigned to you, then we look at the people who are naturally in your world and see how they can provide you support. And then we have what's called integrated service delivery, which means that the PT, OT, speech and language are actually done in the classroom. So what are the challenges? Well, one challenge we have is accountability. No Child Left Behind says every child in the state has to be tested. And so kids with severe disabilities have to be tested on the same curriculum as everyone else, but we can use this extended version of it. Communication skills. For a kid who has no verbal skills, how can he communicate in large and small group instruction? Emphasis in the classrooms on verbal skill, rapid recall, and ability to focus. How do we adjust that for kids with significant disabilities? So we have some teaching practices that we know that work. Task analysis, time delay, simultaneous prompting, least to most prompting, systematic direct instruction, generalization, maintenance. You're going to have an assignment to look those things up. And then classroom considerations. We want to be in chronologically age-appropriate classrooms in a neighborhood school, in the same classroom if the child didn't have a disability. And these are the adaptations we're going to work on as we go through the MAECF. Problems in inclusive classrooms. Hovering paraprofessionals. Is the kid doing the work or is the paraprofessional doing the work? Learned helplessness. The kid learns to let somebody else do it. Class within a class. He's isolated in the back of the room. Guest instead of classmate. If he's not there all the time, the other kids don't see him as a classmate. And then we have some recommended practices. We presume that a kid is competent. We work on inclusive education, getting the kid to be a part of the world. And we recognize that the general ed kids are also going to benefit from this. And then we've got 3 big things that I'm going to give you follow-up on: person-centered planning, functional behavioral assessment, and self-determination. So that is chapter 1.